Just don't move, right?
Steve, I thought you were going to say, like, well, Ben, that's just how I look.
It actually is my better look.
Well, hey, everybody. It is December 17th, 2016, and this is your episode 73 of Percussion. It should be approximately the holiday break when this episode is released, so happy holidays to everybody, and hope you're all getting some nice relaxation. With me, as always, are my friends Megan Arns.
Hello.
And Laurel Black.
Hi.
And Ben, how's it going, buddy?
Hey everybody, doing well.
So you guys joining us today is the author of The Percussionist Art, Same Bed, Different Dreams. He's a world-renowned soloist. He's a conductor. He's a distinguished professor at UC San Diego. And he's also very much responsible for the way solo percussion, and especially contemporary percussion, is today. So really a pleasure to have Mr. Stephen Schick on the show. How you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for that, first of all, overly kind introduction and for taking the time to chat.
Yeah, you're very, very welcome.
Just in case everyone didn't see, Megan and I have your book.
Oh, fantastic. That makes me happy.
Me too.
Well, Steve, tell us a little about your days lately, and has the semester wrapped up for you? Is it a typical jury thing, or what's kicking around?
So we're on the quarter system here at the University of California, which means that the fall term is really easy. We start at the end of September, actually sometimes even as late as the 1st of October, and we wrap up in the second week of December, and everybody feels like this is the way teaching should be. And then the winter and the spring terms run back to back, and so we go from the beginning of January to the middle of June, and that's the payback. So we're at the end of the first of the three quarters that constitute the school year here, and so that's done. Finished my last orchestra concert of 2016 rather, and I'm just practicing for things that are coming up and studying scores. So you caught me at a moment where there's plenty to do, but there's also plenty of time to do it.
That's good.
That must be is that a West Coast thing? Didn't we have Terry Longshore was on the same quarter system? Do you guys remember that?
Yeah.
Yeah, it must be.
Maybe, but I know that Berkeley is on semesters, and so it's just a little varied. It took a little getting used to when I came to UCSD 25 years ago, because instead of a 12 or 15 week semester, we're on 10-week quarters, and so the starting and the stopping and the exams, they come like just everything seems to come so fast.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Do you think you prefer that system, or do you think the more traditional thing is the way to go?
I'm so used to it now that this is kind of just how life is. So it's fine. It's fine.
Cool. Hey, well, we have a lot of Facebook questions, and this is going to be one of those episodes where basically our listeners are going to pretty much provide the whole content of the show, which is great because it means I don't do anything. So I'd like to start with one from our good friend and probably the smartest person I know, Fernando Meza. And Fernando says, what, in your opinion, is the most valuable aspect of contemporary music in a society besieged by musical alternatives, and how can we, as practitioners, best contribute to its appreciation amongst non-musicians?
Those are two very good and very difficult questions. I mean, I would say that for me, and I'm just speaking for myself, that the notion of contemporary music, the contemporariness of contemporary music is what appeals to me. The fact that it comes from a time and a place, a set of circumstances which are sometimes rapidly changing, and contemporary music can react to that. And it also helps remind us that all music, in essence, has, came from a period of time that was contemporary. You read the reviews of the Beethoven Third Symphony, which, we think of now as a pillar of Western culture, but, people hated it at the time. It was chaotic, it was confrontational, it was progressive, and so by embracing contemporary music, you embrace the contemporary in all music, I think. And but I think we're at a crossroads where so many things are happening in the extra musical world that we musicians have to decide to what extent are we going to let that into our art form. I mean, how will we react, or will we react to changes in the cultural and the political and the social environment that we see today? Now, the second part of Fernando's question is a really interesting one. How can we help people understand contemporary music? Well, I think we have to I mean, again, my opinion is that in 2016, contemporary music means something very different than it did in, say, 1986. You know, in the 80s and the 70s, it meant a very particular kind of, there was one thing that it meant, and it usually was kind of high modernist, difficult to listen to, small audiences, you know, these kinds of things. Now, contemporary music has such a breadth of styles, and so many different things can count as contemporary, that it's hard to make it into a single thing. And so I would suggest that there are as many styles of contemporary music as there are listeners and the need to listen. So we can, you know, listeners can find an enormous amount of variety. And then, since I still am devoted to a very large extent to the kind of, you know, the sort of modernist expressions of contemporary music, I still play Xenakis. I was just practicing Feldman when we were, you know, tuning things up here. And I mean, I believe in that music. I love it. It has made me who I am today. And I think that I always take the opinion that treating an audience seriously, you know, presuming that they are capable of listening and understanding and making sense of this music, rather than always trying to kind of provide a conduit to things, means that an audience will respond. Someone who is taken seriously responds in turn, and I think that's what we want to do.
Steve, if I could follow up what you just said, one of my favorite authors is Maurice Sendak, who's the author of Where the Wild Things Are, and he talks about writing children's books, and he says, I don't know what a children's book is, I just write books. And Steve, there's a video of you on YouTube, I think, is it like giving a little lecture and performing some Xenakis for children?
Oh, right, yeah, that one.
And yeah, I mean, it's something you wouldn't think of going to an elementary school and bringing along your, you know, sofa setup, but it's awesome.
Well, first of all, that's all I had. I mean, I didn't have anything else to play for them. And then it reminds me also, my first experiences touring were with this agency called Affiliate Artists, which I think is now defunct, but it set up performances in unconventional performance situations. And so I played Cyclus and Safa 200 times or something like that in central Washington State. That was my first assignment, and I played it in fruit packing plants and retirement centers and libraries and mental health institutions and all over the place. And I didn't have any alternatives, but it proved to me that if you simply play the thing that you care about, what people understand in the first order is how much you care about it, and that's actually kind of what they want in the first place.
You know, I had a similar experience. I played Gita Steiner's Four Bagatelles for vibraphone.
Oh yeah.
Which has a very atonal, pretty challenging piece to listen to for elementary school, and they loved it. You know, they haven't been ruined yet by I don't know, by the world, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Steve.
No, please, no. I'd rather listen. Go ahead.
Oh, no. I was just gonna say. I think that this music would be played for kids is very, very important, because I think they haven't been taught that it's weird. You know.
Yeah, that's the way to say it.
Yeah, and I think of a girl who was like 6 years old back when I taught piano, who liked to make up her own music, and she would write a little story and then make up a melody, and they were always atonal, but she would talk about, see this note coming after that note, it's a little, like they're really close together, and that's like the girl's emotion, that she had to run away because, you know, and she's just talking about, this is the emotion behind these sounds, and it was really
Kids
lovely.
Are smart, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, they're weird too. I mean, I think that's the great thing. I mean, this is what I love about children. They'll say anything. They'll go anywhere, and they'll go with you. I think that's the extraordinary. In fact, what I was going to say, which follows exactly what you were saying, is that I think the people that I have the most difficulty connecting with are in quotation marks music lovers.
Huh.
You know, the people who already feel like they know everything, they know the subtitles of the Haydn symphonies, and they have opinions on Gil Shaham's Portato, you know, this kind of thing. You know, I don't know what to say to somebody like that. But someone who says to me on an airplane, "Oh, I don't know anything about music," I'm all ears, because first of all, that person usually is about to say something fascinating, and I think that is I think those are our people. people who are just interested in exploring, they're well-meaning, they'll take you seriously if you take them seriously. I think that's fantastic.
Does that change? So some of the groups where you have our artistic director, or you're determining where these groups are playing or maybe what the audience is, does that opinion kind of change who you try to play for?
Yeah, it's the people that I work, the artistic direction that I do in San Francisco with the contemporary music players there, that's an ensemble that is 45 years old. It has a very established following of people who expect kind of hardcore contemporary music. And so I'd get into trouble if I played something that was too easy for them.
Sure.
So, but that's a pretty consistent audience. And then the audience that we're building with the La Jolla Symphony is a really interesting one, because it's in many ways, a conventional symphony orchestra audience. And I'm certainly not the first music director that has played contemporary music there, but they've gotten it in pretty steady diet. And now they have opinions about these composers that most people in conventional classical situations have never heard of. So, I think that I believe that every time you play a piece of worthy music well, for an audience that's open-minded, you really can't lose. But those three things have to be there. You can't play badly. You can't play things that aren't worth the attempt. And then you have to have people who are ready to kind of have an experience together. And then I don't think you can lose it.
I have kind of actually, I guess it's kind of two completely different questions that stem from one thing. You talked about being on an airplane and sitting down next to someone you don't know, and when they say, "Oh, I know nothing about music," it's always interesting. And that brought to mind the story of Mark Applebaum had a similar experience with someone that he met that was a florist. And he ended up writing his concerto for a florist and orchestra, which you conducted. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. There are a couple of versions of Concerto for Florist. It's James... Oh my gosh, I wish I could remember we'll think of it, maybe somebody could Google it in the meantime, because I want to give him credit. Del Prince. And he's a great guy. He's the world's greatest performing florist. And Mark, when he was teaching at Mississippi State, met him. And then we did this big sort of Dada thing together at Stanford. And I asked Mark if he would make a version for orchestra. And it was spectacular. We did a program with 3 concertos, the Prokofiev second violin concerto, the Concerto for Florist, and the Bartok Concerto for Orchestra. And it was just this fantastic program. And people then, took the floral creations away.
And then anyway, I said I had 2 questions. My other question in that regard is, what is the most sort of far outside of music collaboration that you've had?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of me being also a musician, I think the circus things that I've done with Roland Osé, I mean, they're very musical, and so it's not something that is a kind of total outlier. I haven't collaborated with a tractor salesman or something like that. But although I did a whole bunch when I was growing up on a farm, but in my life as a musician, I did 2 tours with this French circus company. I was the only boy who wanted to run away from the circus, but that was an amazing kind of thing. And then Roland and I continued to work together. He's doing, we're doing pieces together. Now I've done some conducting of big pieces. I did a piece in Barcelona with the Barcelona National Symphony for Roland's music, an acrobat and an actor, which was just amazing, and the orchestra was totally game for it. So I think that probably is pretty far afield.
Wow. I was speaking of far afield, the Schick Machine, of course, you're playing and collaborating with an instrument builder, but I was worried for your safety for a couple times there.
Believe me, that thing, there's a spot that everybody refers to, and if you haven't seen it or haven't seen the clips, there are a bunch of robotic instruments on stage, and there's one that spins, a disc that spins so fast.
That's when I was afraid, yeah.
And, we've used that now the piece is in existence for 8 or 9 years, and I noticed we played it just at the University of Maryland at the Clarice Smith Center just a couple of weeks ago. And the center hole where the nut holds it is widening because of the amount that and I said, are you guys sure this is not going to spin off? Oh yeah, we check it. But it's death-defying, and when my wife sees that thing, she just can't look at that moment.
Oh, yeah.
All right, we have another Facebook question for
Fantastic.
you. Okay, this one comes from Caleb Pickering. Since we mentioned your book, The Percussionist Art, Caleb asks, if you were to create an addendum to your book, The Percussionist Art, what works, composers, or events would you add since its original 2006 publication?
Well, that's a great question. And I am, well, to say that I'm writing a second book is probably a little optimistic, only because I can't seem to get a kind of center of gravity going for it. But I do have a plan for a second book that will follow up with chamber music and the way in which percussion leads us into access to other issues in life, shall we say. And it comes out of this walk that I took 10 years ago. It's exactly a little bit more than 10 years. I walked from San Diego to San Francisco in the summer of 2006. And I walked primarily to propose to my wife. But I also walked she was living in San Francisco and I lived in San Diego, and I thought, well, that would be a gesture of commitment.
Yeah, I'd say so.
I did put her on the friends and family plan with Verizon, and the guy that sold me that plan thought that was a significant gesture of commitment.
I'm sure he tried to convince you of it.
He did, in fact. So I walked what turned out to be about 750 miles. And it was the most purely Forrest Gump moment of my life, where I simply left the house and started, went to the ocean and turned right.
Did you didn't have camping gear? Where'd you sleep?
No, I didn't at first. The first few days I was able to just take the bus back home, and then after I got too far away, I bought a good walking shoes and a tent and a sleeping bag, and I did a little camping, but mostly I stayed in little motels and stuff along the way. Anyway, what was so astonishing about that walk was the noise floor of California and how meaningful that is. How you can tell where you are by what you hear. And I began to wonder whether if I, as a percussionist, having dealt significantly with noise in basically the entirety of my professional life, did I have any leverage on this issue of what did I learn from sound? And so I've written about 150 pages that compare my view of the pieces that I played with what I learned on that walk. And we'll see if that goes anywhere. But I mean, I've written articles and stuff like that. If that turns into a book, it will be based on that walk. The metaphors that I adopted, and a look at chamber percussion music.
I have a very important follow-up question. Did she say yes?
She did. She first of all knew I was walking. She didn't know why I was walking, but it was important because I didn't. I think disappearing for 6.5 weeks at that critical juncture in the relationship would have been, potentially dangerous. But yes, she did say yes. We went that evening. Good. When I arrived in San Francisco, we went to a restaurant that had valet parking. Because I wasn't going to walk, not even down the street after that. We had a private conversation, and the rest is I'm wearing my wedding ring today. So.
Has talking about perhaps a second book, has writing always been somewhat of an outlet for you, Steve?
The first book was the first real writing that I did, and I don't know what really prompted it, except a set of, I guess I had played those pieces so long as a recitalist that I was looking for access to another level. I mean, these are great, in my opinion, great pieces. The Stockhausen solo and the Xenakis solos and Interieur of Lachenmann, etc. But I'd played Ciklus 700 times or something like that, and I needed a way into a deeper level, and so it seemed to me that writing was the lever, it was kind of the tool that I had in my disposal. And I have done in my adult life, every 4 or 5 years I will take 2 or 3 months off from playing, just stop, to kind of leach the bad habits out. And so I used that time in I think 2002 is when I did the bulk of the writing. I used that time to write the 2 or 3 chapters of the book.
Great. Well, we are going to do one little historical segment here to mix things up just a little bit. So, Ben, you're going to talk about David Lang.
Yes. So I wanted to talk about David Lang in particular because I saw Steve play at PASIC maybe 2010 or 11. anvil chorus, and I was sitting, I think, 3 rows back. I was close enough that I could see Steve putting in his earplugs. And it was like, it's one of those performances that I can just vividly remember everything about it. Like I remember what the table looked like that the break drums were about. So anyway, it kind of affected me in such a way that I wanted to make sure we discuss David Lang today. But I also don't want to talk too much because I want to hear Steve talk more than myself talk. But anyway, so I'll skip over most of the early childhood stuff that I normally kind of go over. But David Lang was born January 8th, 1957 in Los Angeles, California. Interesting fact, that's the same birth date as Elvis Presley and Dave Weckl, different year. But anyway, he studied at Stanford University as an undergraduate student. While he was there, there was a, I guess, sabbatical replacement professor by the name of Martin Jenney who taught. And he was from the University of Iowa, and Lang took a course on French music with him that he said he really wasn't interested in the first place, but it just turned out to be such an amazing course that he followed Jenney back to Iowa for his master's degree, which I know Steve studied at University of Iowa. Were you there at the same time?
Yeah, that's how David and I know each other.
Gotcha. Yeah, I figured.
Yeah.
Just to confirm it. So anyway, then David earned his DMA at Yale in 1989. A few of his teachers that are familiar to percussionists, certainly not an exhaustive list, but the percussion composer types that we would know were Lou Harrison, Jacob Druckmann, and Martin Bresnik. In 1987, he co-founded the Bang on a Can Festival with, or organization, I should say, with Julia Wolf and Michael Gordon. And he's had many collaborators throughout the years involving dance, film, opera, and so on. But some of these collaborators are Julia Wolf and Michael Gordon, as we know, and then Benjamin Millepied, who is a choreographer, and Mac Wellman, who I believe was the librettist for his opera. He won the Pulitzer Prize in 2008 for his Little Match Girl Passion. He's a hugely versatile composer. He's written works for film, opera, orchestra, chamber ensembles, and solo performers. And I read somewhere, and I was trying to find the quote, but it's something about David Lang's music. He tries to write the music that hasn't been written yet, in so many words. So all of his pieces have this sort of very unique uniqueness about them. I can't say anything better than that. His works have been performed by all sorts of just world-class performers, including the Santa Fe Opera, So Percussion, Eighth Blackbird, the New York Philharmonic, the Kronos Quartet, Boston Symphony, Evelyn Glennie, and of course Steve Schick. So a quick little summary of his percussion works in chronological order. The earliest percussion work that I could find anyway was the Anvil Chorus for solo percussion, which was written for Steve. There's a piece called Miracle Ear from 1996 for toy piano and metal pipes. Scraping Song, which is the lyrical counterpart to the Anvil Chorus. The So-Called Laws of Nature, which was written for So Percussion. Unchained Melody from 2004, which is a solo percussion work. String of Pearls from 2006, which is a very challenging solo marimba work. Table of Contents from 2008, which is a percussion duo. A percussion quartet concerto called Man-Made, written in 2013 for So Percussion. And Touch Not the Cat from 2015, which is a tambourine solo / concerto, as I can kind of tell, which was written for Evelyn Glennie's 50th birthday. It's one of those pieces. And then additionally, in all of these works, he also has just an amazing arrangement of Steppenwolf's Born to Be Wild from 1994 that was written for Steve. Yeah. And that is one of the coolest pieces, and it's on my bucket list of pieces to play. But yeah, I love that arrangement so much.
Whose idea was that?
You know, David used to do this arrangement for ensemble where he did the vocals, and I asked him to make a solo percussion version for me.
Nice. Very cool.
Very cool. I got to hear the Little Match Girl Passion earlier this summer. There was a vocal group here that did it, and yeah, Casey helped them get the percussion instruments, and to connect back to one of our earlier topics about, you know, if you just play music you care about for an open audience, they're gonna like it. And I played marimba for about 20 minutes to open this concert, and I played Bach and then 2 movements of Reflections on the Nature of Water. Mm-hmm. And everyone's comments, they're like, the Bach was great, but what about the other movements of the Druckmann? Like, that's what they wanted to hear. They were more interested in that, which was a very cool thing.
Well, and it made the Druckmann so easy to listen to, and the David Lang happened, the Bach happened, and Druckmann just nobody complained. It was great.
It was a really cool program. But I have a Facebook question here.
Yes.
If we're ready to go on. Yes, this is from Diego Becerra. I'm sorry if that's not how to pronounce your name, Diego. But he asks about the relationship between the physical gesture and musical gesture in playing marimba. So his is specific, but if you want to talk about it in all percussion, that'd be great.
Well, I'm probably, certainly amongst the five of us that are chatting, the least likely to be able to have a comment about marimba playing. So you'll excuse me about that. I mean, I think that one of the things that is challenging about the marimba, actually I do play marimba, but it's almost always in the context of other instruments. And so I have a marimba right here next to me, but it's part of the Contacta setup of Stockhausen.
You recorded Autumn Island, didn't you?
I recorded Autumn Island. I still play Autumn Island. I think that's an extraordinary piece. I also recorded String of Pearls. It hasn't been released, but so I've done some marimba playing, and I like playing marimba. I just know my, well, honestly, I think I know my limitations on the instrument. And one of those limitations is that the way I think of gesture is really kind of built on the kind of physiology of the body, so that the rotating joints, both hips and shoulders and all these kinds of things, to me, lend themselves to these kind of curving percussion setups that involve drums and other kinds of instruments. The thing that I've always had trouble with the marimba, and it's actually caused some physical pain, is how do you do that in an instrument which doesn't curve for you? Mm-hmm. And so that's one of the kind of practical issues. But I think an interesting thing about gesture in marimba is also, in the kind of Western context of marimba playing, the one that we know, that we've talked about, that we've taught, and that we've experienced, there's a kind of confusion of gesture that you don't find when you hear the African and the Latin American predecessors of marimba. There, where that music in Africa and in Latin America is so intensely and closely tied to dance, there is the invitation to make marimba gestures that are really quite different from the ones that we talk about when you hear a recital of marimba played at PASIC, for example. And so one of the things that I find so interesting about the marimba is its position on the process and on the scale of acculturation. Because there are percussionists younger than all of us here who, in many cases, know the marimba only as a Western instrument that plays recitals, or that you play your junior recital on at a conservatory. But you don't have to go very far back in history before that didn't even exist. And so what's interesting is this kind of process by which an instrument tied to specific cultures is brought into a kind of European vocabulary, and the problems that, both the problems but also the opportunities that result in that. Seems to me that gesture is one of those areas in marimba playing that is confused in that process. I don't know if that makes any sense to you. Or
yeah.
Well, and it actually relates to several questions that we have, one of them being from a really popular marimbist, Theodor Milkov, who says, hello, everyone. One question, when it comes to contemporary music, where is the red line between being precise and interpretation, which by that he means self-expression? Thank you for your time. Thanks, Theo.
That's a question I feel like I'm a little bit more in a position of answering, if you don't mind jumping to that.
Yeah.
I had a conversation with Brian Ferneyhough, the composer of Bone Alphabet, and if you've seen the score to Bone Alphabet, you understand the rhythmic complexity of it and the difficulties of learning it. But also in the score of Bone Alphabet are all of these musical indications, like to play capriccioso or to play in modo analitico is one. There are these in typical Italian phrases that we see all the time in classical music. The piece is decorated with that. And so what happens when the rigors of the rhythmic language come into conflict with the instructions, with the expressive instructions of the score? What do? And it's one of the reasons that piece is so fascinating to me, because in the Western mind, and I think especially percussionists trained in the United States, we take a look at a rhythm like 17 against 13, and a marking of capriccioso. And we take the 17 against 13 much more seriously than we take capriccioso. We get our graph out, we start making quadratic equations. If you play the 17 against 13 wrong, then you're not playing the piece. And then we may or may not get around to adding those other kinds of things. And so sometimes that question about interpretation really comes from a cultural orientation towards a certain kind of value that we afford the right rhythms, the right pitches, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not arguing that those things are unimportant, but I think that we have to understand that our perspective pushes them towards the center of the stage.
Well,
go ahead.
And Laurel's heard me complain about this several times. I feel like there are performers out there that you'll see they're hiding behind the fact that it's contemporary, and they think, well, it's contemporary, so it's really cerebral, and so I can just like be stoic and just play.
Yep.
And I think about, like I said in your introduction, I feel like you have really, done so much for contemporary percussion, but you did not teach people to play that way. You're very expressive.
I don't hear music that way. I mean, thank you for that kind comment. But I mean, the ears that I have that listen to Stockhausen, Gesang der Junglinge, or Varese Désert, or whatever piece of contemporary music, whatever piece of light your hair on fire contemporary music you might want to think of, are the same ears that I listen to Patsy Cline and Miles Davis and late Beethoven with. I don't make that distinction. So if I'm not moved by a piece of contemporary music, I don't think it's worth playing. Or it's not worth playing that way. Now, I mean, every language has its own rhetoric, and you have to decide as a performer, what are the bounds of the discourse of this language? Could you, for example, in Xenakis, take a huge romantic retard because it's expressive? And my answer to that is no, because it's not in the language of Xenakis. But once you speak the language of Xenakis, are there ways of making the musical experience impactful and moving? And that answer is yes. I just want to quote really quickly this conversation I had with Brian about Bone Alphabet. I asked him that exact question. What is interpretation in this piece? Because in I don't know if you can see or hear me, but if you have these two rhythms, for example, gata, gata, in Brahms, that's the same rhythm. One of them is a cadence, the other is part of the middle of a phrase or whatever. They have two different contexts. But these rhythms, gata, gata, in Bone Alphabet are two different rhythms. One is 17 against 13 and the other one is 11 against 9, for example, And so when the distinctions are so slight, what can a performer do to alter the text? And I said, what is interpretation in that context? And Brian said, interpretation is meaningful deviation from the score. Meaningful deviation from the score. So it's up to the performer to figure out what is meaningful and to assert that this change that I'm making is meaningful and for which you get an effect, but for which you also have to take responsibility. So if you do that huge swooping rallentando and Safa for a kind of cheap effect, in my opinion, yeah, it may work in a certain way, but you also have to take account for it. And by the way, having known Xenakis, he'll have some harsh words for you in the afterworld.
Wow. So
yeah, you wouldn't want to meet up with Giannis after having done that.
Oh man.
Can you tell us about Xenakis?
Yeah,
and,
please.
Knowing him?
I mean, I met him on a number of occasions, and I played all of those big pieces for him. I played Pléiade and Persefasa. We did just the second performance of Pléiade for Xenakis in London in a festival that James Wood organized. I did the first American performance of Rebond, and he was there. And Xenakis was interesting, and I'm a sort of, or at least I was a modest Iowa farm boy, right? And I didn't want to hang out with him. I didn't want to have, I was afraid of him. So I didn't solicit like moments where it was just the two of us alone over a beer. That would have been too much. But I did spend some time with him. And it would be difficult to get Xenakis to talk about, like I asked him about that quintuplet at the beginning of Safa. For those of you who have played that, there's all of a sudden this feels like a little glitch in the rhythm of the piece, like this single 5 against 4. I said, what is that about? And he just literally would not answer the question. So I think it was hard to talk to Xenakis about the kinds of musical issues you would talk to most composers. You couldn't say, am I rushing my triplets? Or something like that. But he did have very strong opinions about the power and the weight of sounds. the kind of architectural robustness of the performance. And so the kinds of things you would expect from an architect and a noise musician you would get from him, but he wouldn't say, the Balter Greens are not really the mallet for this moment. He wouldn't say anything like that.
Thank goodness, because we hear enough of that, I think.
Yeah, I think we hear plenty of that.
I had a question. It's something you said earlier, kind of like set off a tangent in my mind. And it's funny, like I made a little joke in our little text feed here about like Steve says, I know my limitations on marimba, and it's like this is the guy that recorded Autumn Island.
Yeah,
like,
that's a hard piece.
Piece that no one can touch. And then it also reminded me of two books I've read. One was The Innovators by Walter Isaacson, where it talks about Nolan Bushnell, who's the founder of Atari. When he was developing some sort of space game on computers back in the day, and the computers didn't have the processing power to do everything he needed, so he kind of determined what the most important elements of the game were and was able to do some hardware tricks, and anyway, he got it to work. And then in your book, you talked about learning bone alphabet, and it's funny because I think people automatically just assume that Steve Schick is some sort of genius and can just sight read bone alphabet. But you talk about the complexities of the piece are far beyond you, and you had to, you called it flatten the rhythm. So you had to figure out what all the different lines were that were going on, and then how it all felt as just one layer that you could actually perform. So could you tell us about how, as a performer, especially in learning pieces, you've overcome your kind of human limitations?
Yeah, I think that the example you talk about in Bone Alphabet is a really good one. The flattening is as a strategy for dealing with 3 and 4 rhythmic levels at the same time. But then, of course, the strategy in performance and interpretation is to reinflate those so it doesn't sound flat. And that's actually the far harder part than the calculation of what note comes first and what note comes second. But this is another issue. I mean, we began talking about the role of contemporary music, and this misunderstanding of contemporary music is in that it is cerebral or unapproachable. I mean, I am proudly a solid B student. I was hired by the University of California in an institution that would not have admitted me as an undergraduate. And so I don't think that this is music that is reserved for, cerebral, brainy people. I think what it needs and what we're really talking about is it needs passion and it needs commitment. And the key to Bone Alphabet for me was not the ability to sight read it. I don't think anyone can sight read it. In fact, can I just tell you a quick story about that, which is that I asked Brian to write Bone Alphabet for me. He first said no, he wasn't interested, and he gave me a bunch of reasons, which I think, could be interesting if we had time to unpack them. But then he changed his mind, and within a few days, he sent me 20 sample measures, which eventually found their way into the piece in different points. And he asked me, what did I think? Well, these were by a factor of about 100, the hardest music I had ever seen in my life. I didn't think that I or anybody was ever going to be able to play it. So I said, looked good. And we went out from there, And so I just knew that I couldn't even conceive of a solution to those rhythmic problems on the fly. But 1,200 hours of practice later, there it was finished.
Yeah. Wow.
That's what I had to offer is
I should have told him just use a player piano like Nankaro.
Well, that's a common question with those rhythms because, of course, they can be rendered on computer like that and perfectly accurate. But that's not the music that he's after. He's after that kind of heat that comes from a human performer. He's after the 1,200 hours, basically.
Yeah.
Well, and I guess just to be clear, Hugh does want you to play what's there, right?
Oh yeah, no, it's not try your best and we'll all be, there are no participation awards in music,
Yeah.
But he understands that what will eventually happen is that you have this superfluity of information that runs through the frailty of the human circuitry, and what comes out is so much right, even if it's not always accurate. I don't know if that
Sure,
that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, and when I explain new complexity to students, I hope I'm doing this right, but it's, minimalism is a response to serialism, and then new complexity is a response to minimalism. And somewhere in there, I thought I saw, it's almost needs to be impossible because it is so complex. And that made me wonder, like, well, so are you actually supposed to pull it off, or is that contrary to the mission of what it is?
It's a fantastic entry into that. And first of all, Brian would reject the term new complexity.
Okay.
And I've heard him say in conversation once, show me a piece of music that is not complex, and I'll accept the title. Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, as a process of uttering a melody and perceiving it and all the memories that come and everything, that's an incredibly complex perceptual and musical event, even for something as simple as that. Yeah. Anyway, I'm sorry, there are a lot of ways to go, and I didn't mean to jump in on you that way, but I think that he would not accept that the new complexity table.
Cool, great. Laura, what do you have there?
Yeah, well, a lot of what you've been saying, Steve, has been connecting with me in terms of discussions that I would have in acting classes with theater professors. And so as a segue to a lot of other questions we have about pedagogy, I'm wondering, do you think of yourself as an actor at times? Have you had training in that? Just anything you have to say along those lines.
I've never had training in acting in the same way that I didn't ever have training as a conductor, and I think that those two things are hugely beneficial. The absence of training is the thing that we really should remember is itself a value. And I'm interested in acting, and I'm doing more and more of it. I'm learning now. The memorization process is wildly difficult, but I'm learning Beckett Cascando to do a solo version of Beckett, where because he asks for musical interludes to be put in between these moments of text. And in fact, there are lots of examples of incidental music for Beckett. Philip Glass, among others, has written them. A lot of people have. And so I thought, well, I would create a version of Cascando where I also played the musical interludes. And it's funny because Beckett says he wants the untrained voice. He doesn't want a trained actor. And so I thought, well, sign me up.
That's right.
It's in my wheelhouse not to be trained. But then I realized the difficult thing is that people who are not trained as actors immediately start to imitate badly trained actors.
Exactly.
It's super hard to be untrained and to get that voice that doesn't have affectation and is not projected and everything like that. And then I started thinking about, do we do this in our lives? Do we take the training that we've got, and instead of absorbing the outside world and bringing it into ourselves, are we always performing our training wherever we go? Are we on stage wherever we go? Do we constantly interrogate an interesting real-life moment for what its musical potential is? And so I think Beckett is teaching me quite a bit to see if it's possible to reverse that process and to really be the innocent and to really be the naive voice that so often is helpful or so often useful to us.
You feel that in music too? I mean, the value of lack of training in music, and like sometimes we're just overtrained and we lose
we're
some of
overtrained.
that natural ability.
I think we're overtrained. I mean, I was extremely lucky. Amongst the second only to meeting my wife, the other relationship which I'm so grateful for is the one with Thomas L. Davis, who was my teacher at the University of Iowa. And what he did for me was so generous. He gave me 3 semesters of very, very good, very basic training, holding 4 mallets, playing a good snare drum roll. And he played traditional grip. He was left-handed, and his left-hand stroke was like just to die for. And timpani and all that sort of stuff. And at the end of those 3 semesters, he said to me, that's all I can do for you. I don't know anything about the music you're interested in, and I will help you to the extent that I can, but you're on your own. And I was 19, And by the way, I didn't have any lessons before that. Those 3 semesters of actual training where I showed up every week for lessons that was it, has been it. And about Mr. Davis, the idea that he didn't try to bend me into a version of himself, that he gave me what he had, and then he was simply there, listening and reacting as a real person, was probably the most generous thing anybody has ever done for me. And so in 40-some years of teaching, or 35 years, I guess, of teaching, I've steadfastly tried not to instruct anybody on anything. But I've tried to help them. And so I think, to get back to your question, which is a super good one, I think we can be too highly trained. Yes, I think that the raw materials, the skills, and then going for the thing that you care about is what we should be doing.
Yeah.
It seems like students get overly technical and they lose sight of what they originally loved, and the perspective turns to, well, what makes it good is holding it the proper way and having all these strokes even, and I tell a student, do this. Oh, but if I do that, then my strokes won't be even anymore. It's like, good, they shouldn't be even.
I remember
we don't need to keep doing that through college.
I had a student that was playing one castanet because he wanted it to sound even. It's like, no, it's a folk instrument that's entirely wrong.
I did this with Steve Reich once. I played maracas and 4 organs, still with a bang and a can. And I had my maracas, I had my Temescal maracas, and I'd practiced so that it was just like a perfect, like that. And he took these, the yellow maracas that they all play, and he said, no, it goes like this. Sha, 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 sha. Maracas spraying everywhere. But the sound he wanted, it wasn't that purity. Casey, I wanted to ask you, or everybody, because I know we're all teachers, do you feel, as I sometimes do, that that kind of focus on that refinement of training is caused in percussionists of a young generation the kind of growth of anxiety? Because when I go to master classes, I hear people talk to me, or when I give master classes, I hear people talk to me about how they can't keep up with the expectations that the percussion world is placing on them, that they are masterful timpanists and that they can play, marimba like a fiend, but they're also in the steel pan group and they play berimbau, and they just, it feels like a bunch of tests, and oftentimes people just feel, well, I'm just failing. I'm failing everything, because there are so many things to know. I mean, do you have that impression at all?
Yeah, I do. And I can think back when I went to PASIC for the first time, which I think I was maybe a senior in high school, maybe a freshman in college, something like that. And we went as a group. So this is our studio at Utah State University. Well, Dennis Griffin was still the professor there. And it pumped me up. I just saw all this stuff and I thought this was so cool. And I knew, I can't be a master drum set player. I can't be a master hand percussionist. I can't do all those things. And that was okay with me, and it was okay with some of us. But some of the people, they left PASIC really depressed.
Yeah, I did get that impression when I was younger, when I went to PASIC, kind of that overwhelmed feeling. But the thing that really, I think when I discovered this, it put me at ease, was hearing about Glenn Gould and him talking about how at a certain point in his life, he was just done with live performance, because he said it felt like some sort of, circus where the audience would show up to anticipate the performer screwing up, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And he went entirely, obviously, to recorded music as a medium. But it kind of, I don't know, there was a sense of relief when I realized that no live performance would ever be perfect. That's why it's a live performance. And Casey's talked about before seeing Evelyn Glennie drop a drumstick when she was playing, and the recovery was so much cooler than if she hadn't done it in the first place. And so before my students' performances or juries or whatever, I always tell them, I know you're going to make a mistake. It's okay. Don't get caught up on that. Yeah. And I think that kind of helps relieve the anxiety a bit.
Yeah, and I think the amount of options is a beautiful thing in our field, because I often think that if I was in another instrumental area, I wonder if I wouldn't be a musician, or at least a professional musician, because I hate the competition aspect of it. And I feel like if I was pressured more by that, that I wouldn't love making music anymore. And so I think the beauty of that and by offering a lot to our students of different options in world percussion and, kind of having a very well-rounded curriculum, it does allow them to kind of help them find their voice and what they're drawn to and what their passion is.
What would you have done if you hadn't been a percussionist and been a musician?
I think, honestly, now, I think I would be a traveling nurse.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
I was on my way to be a general practitioner doctor in a small Iowa town. I started studying music and pre-med at the same time. And so I know that if I had been a violinist, just as you said, I so resonate with this. And if I'd gone into like this kind of this competitive aspect of things, I wouldn't have made it. It's just the percussion was perfect for me at that time, because there were just we just didn't have that. And so you could be in a practice room in Iowa City and just be working on stuff completely, oblivious to the rest of the world, and it counted for something. Otherwise, I wouldn't have done it, I don't think.
Yeah.
All of what we're talking about with overtraining, it resonates with me as you get so much instruction that it just locks you up. Like you're playing this piece that that your teacher knows really well, and you play 3 bars and they're like, no, and then you fix it, and then they're like, well, now it's not doing anything, now it's not musical. It's like, yeah, well, obviously.
What did you expect was going to happen?
Yeah, I know.
She's talking about a mode that our teacher was Nancy Zeltzman Laurel and I at several times, and that's a mode she can turn on. That's
Nancy
really
mode. Yeah.
Great teaching tool, but yeah, it's tough to
but it's really hard to take, and I identified with that. So, and even in undergrad, before I met Nancy, that happening, and so I identify with these students that you're talking about. Tell you they always feel like they're failing because you hear so many things: do this, don't do that, do this, don't do that. That you easily put aside your own thoughts because you assume they're invalid because they're not informed.
Yeah. But I've never said that. I don't think and I don't know, maybe this is a weird way that I have of teaching, but I have never once said to a student, don't do that. I would if I thought that the person was about to hurt him or herself, if there was a physical thing. But otherwise, I'm much more interested as a person in the cost-benefit analysis of a decision. If you do this, what do you gain and what do you lose? And so that's to me much more interesting. And what I tell my students, and especially recently I'm on this, this has occurred to me as an interesting strategy, is that instead of opting for the decision that you want and then rhapsodizing about how great this interpretive decision is, you examine the one that you're giving up. Like, instead of doing this, you're doing this. Well, take a look at the thing that you're not going to do, and then be willing to say goodbye to the beautiful things that has to offer. Because if it doesn't have a lot to offer, then it's not really a decision. And so I think it's really interesting to wonder almost wistfully about an interpretive decision. I'm not going to play it this way, but what am I losing by not playing it that way? And then it becomes a system of choices rather than a system of obligations.
This is totally just a hypothesis I have, but I feel like that overtraining that we're talking about is maybe the difficulty of grading, codifying what we do, putting everything into a test format, being able to have something to say for an hour every week to the students, plus another hour for studio class. I just wonder if it's the academy's fault.
Yeah, I mean, because we're being forced into a situation that pre-exists us, right? And so it's a teaching style and an academic structure that suits so many different kinds of things. I don't really know if it suits us. I think about, John Luther Adams is my best friend, or was one of my dearest friends, and John often talks about Barnett Newman, the painter, and about how the Newman paintings are almost always a horizontal plane, and then there's a solitary vertical, what Newman would call zip, a vertical presence. And he said, that's the artist, a person alone exploring a vast landscape with no signposts. And of course, what we do, I do it in my class here at UC San Diego, I'm sure that we all do this, is we create structures for students so that they can navigate this. But every structure we create, however helpful it is something that doesn't exist in that Newman metaphor, and something that actually robs us of a certain kind of paradigm of discovery as well.
We've all been to that master class where the student plays amazingly, and then the person giving the class feels like, oh crap, if I don't say something, I'm going to look like an idiot. So they invent stuff to say. Really, they should probably just point out what they liked, tell everyone what this person's doing that's really good is this, and I really like that. Thank you very much. Maybe ask them some questions.
Yep.
Because I know I felt that way giving masterclass, and it took some time before I was like, you know what? I don't have to say anything. I don't. It's okay. Ben, I'm sorry I stepped over what you were going to say.
Yeah, this is going back to what Megan was talking about with the sort of diversity of the field. And when I look at other instruments, like let's say Martha Argerich on piano or Yo-Yo Ma on cello, with maybe the exception of the, I'll call hyper-contemporary music, these people are expected to play everything from Bach all the way up to the Bartok basically, at just an extraordinarily high level. And then when I look at percussionists and I compare Steve Schick to Keiko Abe to Dave Weckl, if Dave Weckl tried to play one of Abe's marimba pieces, it would be a disaster. And so, we've kind of, as percussionists, because of the diversity, we've turned ourselves into specialists. And so I hate to ask someone to predict the future, but Steve, what do you think the future of percussion holds as far as will we continue to specialize into even more narrow channels? Will people start to actually be able to comprehend the diversity of the field, or?
Well, Ben, I think it's a really interesting question. I guess I see it a little differently than you described it, because it's true that I couldn't sit down on a drum set and make anything other than a kind of amateurish splash. But when you look at Marta Argerich, she doesn't play Indian music, or she doesn't improvise. And so I tend to think of that as a sort of almost more monocultural activity than what percussionists do. So I think specialization, now to get back to your question, I think specialization is in our future, because we are an increasingly atomized cultural landscape. There are so many different kinds of things that are separated from one another. But I also tend to think that people are much freer to wander between those expertises. When we were talking about David, I remember being in a class with David Lang at the University of Iowa. We were talking about Wozzeck, and David made some comment about the Talking Heads. This was the 80s, right? So that was a relevant comment at that point. And I thought, oh my God, he's going to get it now. He's referred to rock music in the hallowed analytical course.
That's hip now. Yeah.
But now my students, they don't think that there's this. Those walls between improvisers and the players of notated music, between people who practice tabla and who practice snare drum, those are all falling down. And if you tell somebody today, oh, you have to decide whether you're going to play jazz or classical, they look at you like you're young, because it makes no sense to them. And so I think that yes, there are an extraordinary number of specialties, but that the firewalls between those specialties are weakening, and so that we can gerrymander our way through really interesting kinds of sets of meta specialties, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. I guess my hope is that the language will just become clearer, because you go to a job interview, let's say university job interview, and everyone has their idea of what a percussionist should be.
Yeah.
So you play what you do your best, and then you always hear about the guy who says like, well, they didn't play any steel pan. We really need someone to.
Yeah.
Why didn't they play more drum set? It's like everyone has their own point of view of what a percussionist is supposed to be.
And that's different from a musician. Like, when I'm interested in working with somebody, I want to find a musician, and that person might do a lot of different kinds of things.
Yeah.
But we live in this life that is so full of specialties. I mean, I drive a German car. I have a French watch on. I bought these pants at the local surf shop, and I had Thai food last night. I don't say to myself, "Oh my God, what a crisis! How can I cope with such a fractured life?"
Sure.
No, we just negotiate these things naturally. So why shouldn't we in the world of music?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Who's got a last Facebook question?
I could do one.
Great.
I guess going back to students and anxiety, and the question of are we headed in this direction of just being very overwhelmed as percussionists, and looking at all of us as as educators. Shaun Tilburg, a great friend of the At Percussion podcast, asks, what kind of preparation practice would be helpful for someone just entering college that is positive they want to follow in your line of work? And some examples he lists are polyrhythms, score study, acting. What do you think?
Reading. I think again to go back to the idea of that you're more interested in hearing a human being play rather than a specialist, monster, virtuoso. At least this is how I feel. I think someone who is interested in the world, and for me that comes through books. That's probably a little bit too facile an answer because, of course, the polyrhythmic stuff you have to have a skill set. You have to have tools to deploy. But then once you get out on stage, you have to have something to say. Mm-hmm. So for me, I read, but constantly, voraciously. I study languages. I read newspapers in different languages pretty much every day. This is just me. I'm not suggesting that this is what someone else should do. But I found that sometimes it's confusing the world. And sometimes it's bewildering and overwhelming. But being a percussionist at home in the world is the main thing that I'm after. And sometimes you get close and sometimes you're way off. But I think that that's the one thing that's really ignored as a skill set that you have to. I remember my first lecture at Manhattan School of Music before I became a kind of regular teacher there. I just stopped and I said, I think that percussion is irrelevant to us. It is only the tool that we have in our hand. But what we're really interested in is what we think about our lives. So what are you reading? And the look of dread that passed along this room that I was going to I didn't, of course, pick on anybody. As it turned out, none of those students was reading anything. And I thought, okay, well, there's your big problem. Let's start with fixing that one.
Mm-hmm. So what are a couple of books that are on your list? I'm sure there are many, but could you give us a few of your favorites?
I just read James Baldwin, The Fire Next Time, which was just amazing. This is a little bit in the post-November moment. I'm reading Independent People, the Icelandic book, the Laxness book, which is really fantastic. And I read 2 or 3 things at once, and sometimes I don't finish them. But I'm fascinated. And then as I said, studying languages is a little bit of a hobby. So the Italian newspapers come the night before. So late at night, I'll get the next day's newspaper from Italy, and I'll spend some time with that.
Awesome. Wow, very cool. Well, guys, I think it's about time to wrap. And I'm going to once again steal the quote from Laurel to wrap up the episode. You guys will never guess, especially you, Steve, you'll never guess who said this.
Okay.
And it actually has not, I don't know if it's committed to paper, but I took it from a talk that this person gave and did my best to transfer it to paper. So here it goes. Solo percussion music is such a recent advent, and it occurred to me on my 50th birthday that I am in fact older than the oldest solo piece in my repertoire, which is really a crazy thing. Imagine a pianist being older than the oldest piece in his or her repertoire. I account the first solo percussion piece to be John Cage's 27 minutes and 10.554 seconds. That was made in 1956. I was made in 1954. So I'm older than the oldest piece. This brings up thoughts of a common discussion amongst musicians, that of composers and the myths of origination. The type of late-night discussion you would have over a glass of wine, where you might say, can you imagine what it would have been like to be there at the Champs-Élysées, where The Rite of Spring was premiered, or maybe perhaps Throw a Tomato on stage? Can you imagine hearing the first performance of a late Beethoven string quartet, or tapping Mr. Brahms on his shoulder to ask what he thought of the premiere of his Second Symphony? These thoughts make people look off in a kind of reverie and think, wow, wouldn't it have been fabulous to have been there? And friends, in the world of percussion, we are there. This is the age in which we live. The masterpieces, the cornerstones of the repertoire, the way in which we speak to our students about the world, the things that we do every day in the practice room, and even very young percussionists have seen the birth of a new art form. It's absolutely fantastically exciting. You guys are never going to guess who said that.
I seem to remember might have said that.
I was going to say Pius Chang. So anyway, yeah.
Beautiful.
By Mr. Stephen Schick. I hope you don't mind that I hijacked something you said out loud and turned it committed it to paper, but I thought it was really moving.
That's very nice of you. And I have to tell you, I have so enjoyed this hour, a little bit more than an hour, and I wish it didn't have to end. And what you're doing with the podcast and just the way this conversation continues into the future with people of a younger generation. For me, I'm going to take the rest of the day off and know that our art is in good hands. Thank you so much for being there.
It's awesome. Thanks a lot,
Thank you.
Steve.
Thanks.
Great. Good. Enjoy your holidays, everybody.
Okay.
You too.
You too.
You too.
Stay out of the ice and snow.
All right.
Yeah.
Hey, thanks everybody. Take it easy.
Bye.
Bye.